Shall we?
Can we start?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That's it.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Ethics at Noon, and congratulations on surviving various snowstorms, and thank you for making it here despite the weather. Let's welcome Professor Ryan Cox, giving us a talk on fairness in education.
Yeah. Thanks for coming, given the weather, and thanks to the Centre for Ethics for hosting me. It's been great so far. All right, so I want to start by setting out the issue. So in modern societies with advanced economies, where you end up in the occupational hierarchy has a significant impact on your life prospects, on how well your life goes. Positions higher in the hierarchy lead to higher life prospects. Positions lower in the hierarchy are associated with lower prospects. Now, where you end up in the occupational hierarchy is determined in large part, to the extent that our societies are meritocratic, by where you rank in the educational hierarchy, how well you do at school. So for these reasons, education can be said to have a competitive aspect in modern societies. Education is a positional good, as it's sometimes put. Now, for these reasons, given that education has this competitive aspect, it seems particularly important that a system of education is fair. So that's the issue. How should we think about fairness in systems of education of the kind we're familiar with, competitive systems of education? So many think we should think about fairness in terms of equality of opportunity. So in slogan form, everyone should have an equal opportunity of being among those sufficiently well ranked in terms of educational outcomes. Or everyone should have an equal chance of being sufficiently well ranked, or sometimes it's put in this more qualified way, all individuals with the same ability and same motivation should have roughly the same chances of being sufficiently well ranked in the system of education. Indeed, many think that we should think about equality of opportunity in terms of a particular approach, which I call the improper influence approach. So on this approach, we begin by thinking about all the different things that can affect an individual's educational outcomes and thereby affect their life prospects. Right, we've just seen how education affects life prospects. We take this broad view, we think about all the different things that can influence outcomes. We note that some of these things are illegitimate or improper influences on differences in outcomes, and some are proper influences. When we take this perspective, almost everyone agrees that social class background is an improper or illegitimate influence. So it's unjust or unfair, according to the improper influence approach, for differences in educational outcomes and therefore life prospects to be due to differences in social class background. Fairness, at the very least, requires that, all else being equal, individuals from different social class backgrounds should have roughly the same chances of being sufficiently well ranked. Okay. So the improper influence approach gives a nice explanation of why fairness requires this. And it does this by appealing to a distinction between proper and improper influences. Now, the improper influence approach is the leading egalitarian approach to fairness and equality of opportunity. The influence of the approach is largely due to Rawls, who poses issues of fairness in this way in his informal arguments early in A Theory of Justice. Although it's a matter of some controversy as to whether this really represents his official view. Still, this is where this style of thinking originated. So more on the details of what I'm calling the improper influence approach soon. This talk is about why the improper influence approach is the wrong approach to fairness and equality of opportunity, and about why we need a different approach. Right, so the structure is pretty straightforward. I'm going to characterize the improper influence approach in more detail. I'll present some problems with the approach. I'll sketch an alternative approach to fairness, and I'll try to convince you that it provides a better explanation of fairness and equality of opportunity in a central range of cases. Okay, so pretty clear on the issue, the question, and the structure of the talk. Okay, so let me start by saying more about the improper influence approach. So we've seen how the approach poses the question of fairness. You take this broad view about all the different things that can influence outcomes, and you pick and choose the improper and proper influences. So we can get quite far just listing the things we think are improper influences, right? Everyone agrees, social class background, improper. Most people would agree that perceived gender differences, improper. Religious affiliation, improper. Okay? But what we ultimately want is a theory of improper influences. What makes something an improper influence? What makes something a proper influence? So I've puzzled over this for a while now, because there are various different lists offered and various different rationales offered. But I think there are two main varieties of the improper influence approach, and they appeal to two different theories of proper and improper influences. So there's an older variety, not often clearly articulated in the literature, which I call the social influence theory, right? Fairness requires that differences in educational outcomes not have social causes, right, as opposed to natural causes. And that will generate a relatively standard list of improper influences. Social class background is a social cause. Right. A different, more modern approach I call the responsibility theory. And it says, fairness requires that differences in educational outcomes not be due to things an individual is not responsible for. Right? So again, this generates a relatively standard list of improper influences. Both do pretty well at explaining why something like social class background is an improper influence. Well, social class background is a social cause. Social class background is something individuals are not responsible for. So kind of these theories explain the central cases. Now, the responsibility theory comes in a moderate version and an extreme version, depending on your views of responsibility. So the moderate version thinks that differences in the amount of effort an individual puts in are proper influences, right? It's okay for differences to depend on different amounts of effort. The extreme version says individuals are not even responsible for the amount of effort they put into learning. So that's an improper influence. Both are versions of the responsibility theory. So let's agree that there's something to be said in explaining why certain influences are improper influences in terms of there being social causes or individuals not being responsible for them. So there's some intuitive appeal to these explanations. So before raising some problems for the improper influence approach, I just want to draw some attention to some abstract characteristic features of the approach that will be relevant later. So one is that people who defend this approach to fairness and equality of opportunity often couple it with a kind of pluralism. And we'll see why this matters later. So they say things like, this is my principle, but don't forget that it's just one principle. It's a pro tanto principle that needs to be weighed against others. Equality is just one value that is to be weighed against others in assessing a system of education. So that's one feature, characteristic of this kind of approach. Another kind of abstract feature is that the assessments of fairness on this approach are insensitive to how these kind of different ways of arranging a system of education affect individual interests, right? All that it takes is that the system does affect people's interests, and what we have to do is then get rid of these influences, right? But what it says, the answer it gives, eliminate these influences, is insensitive to kind of distribution of welfare on different alternatives. And the final kind of abstract feature of this approach is its incompleteness. So if you think about at least the social cause theory, it says that individuals from the same social class background, all else being equal, should have the same chances of success. But it's silent, right, on what kind of chances of success individuals with differing natural abilities or educational abilities should have. So the view often needs to be supplemented by an additional principle. So let me put that another way. If you say that fairness requires that individuals with the same ability and motivation have the equal chances of being well ranked, well, what do you say about people who are unequal in ability and motivation? Right? There's a kind of gap in the theory that needs supplementing. So proponents of this kind of view often appeal to a principle of equality supplemented by some other principle, a principle of priority or maximizing welfare. So those are the kind of characteristic features of this approach, and we'll see that they partly explain the problems the approach faces. Okay, so now having presented the approach and discussed some of the characteristic features, I want to set out some problems for it, and some of these are familiar. So the leveling down objection is perhaps the most familiar. But these familiar objections are often offered in ways that are uncharitable to proponents of the improper influence approach, I say. For one, they often overlook the appeal to pluralism. And often no attempt is made to explain our judgments about fairness that the improper influence approach gets right. So no alternative theory is offered, or no error theory is offered. And criticisms often fail to offer a diagnosis of where exactly the improper influence approach goes wrong. So I think we kind of need to do better to unseat this kind of approach. So I think the familiar objections to equality of opportunity, as understood on the improper influence approach, can be combined to present a serious dilemma for the approach. And it's only when it's posed this way that you kind of see the seriousness of the problem. This is more or less familiar from some of the recent literature, but this is my take on it. So here's the dilemma. Maximizing fit with the intuitive motivation for the improper influence approach minimizes fit with intuitive verdicts about particular cases. Whereas maximizing fit with intuitive verdicts about fairness in particular cases minimizes fit with intuitive motivation. So let's go through each horn of that dilemma. So the first horn, the social influence theory collapses into the responsibility theory. Reflection on why social causes are improper influences pushes one towards the responsibility theory. Why is social class background an improper influence? Why are socially caused influences improper? Well, they're improper because they're things an individual is not responsible for. But then so are natural causes. So the social cause theory, the social influence theory, collapses into the responsibility theory. The responsibility theory, in either form, would seem to require us to level down in many cases where intuitively leveling down does not seem to be the right thing to do, right? So if you think about the responsibility theory, right, we've got to remove all influences on educational outcomes that an individual is not responsible for. That's going to require some kind of radical intervention. So because the responsibility theory is far more radical, there are just going to be far more cases where the only way we can achieve equality of opportunity, according to that theory, is by leveling down in significant ways. It's just more demanding. So in order to avoid this problem, proponents of the responsibility theory appeal to pluralism. Equality is not all that matters. I told you that. In these cases, the value of kind of maximizing welfare or giving priority to the worst off is more important. Fine. But here's the kind of edge of the objection. This just leads to the problem that verdicts about fairness and unfairness are stripped of much of their normative force. Egalitarians will too often find themselves saying, yes, it's unfair, but we've got to tolerate it for this or that value. This doesn't fit with our starting assumption that unfairness is a serious failing, a serious moral failing. If the system of education is unfair, that's a serious failing and we had better do something about it. At this stage, the proponent of the responsibility theory is saying, yeah, it's unfair because of these differential influences, but other things matter, right? So the real force of the leveling down objection, I think, is that it forces the proponent of the improper influence approach to water down assessments of fairness too far. Moreover, there's a worry that the proponent of the improper influence approach gets their fit with intuitive verdicts by appealing to pluralism in a kind of ad hoc way. They just appeal to other values when they need to avoid counterexamples and objections. Okay, that's the first horn, because we start with the social influence theory, and that collapses into the responsibility theory, and then that has problems. Second horn, social influence theory seems to require us to level down in fewer cases. Good. You might still need to appeal to pluralism to avoid some of the worst leveling down objections, but this may not water down fairness too far. So we're kind of closer to our intuitive verdicts about fairness and unfairness. But the problem now is that the social influence theory just doesn't seem to draw a normatively deep cut. Right? The social cause, natural cause distinction is just not normatively very deep. As the responsibility theory points out, and as Rawls pointed out a long time ago, both social causes and natural causes, at least in early education, seem to be on the side of things an individual is not responsible for. Okay, so the social influence theory has kind of unstable normative foundations. It looks appealing to start with, but you can't just stop at social causes. Okay, so that's the dilemma. That's the main problem. So where does the improper influence theory approach go wrong? So in my view, it goes wrong in losing sight of the fact that we're trying to make sense of a fair competition. We're trying to make sense of how having a competitive system of education is compatible with a basic structure that represents fair terms of cooperation. If you squint at the improper influence approach from the right direction, you see that it's a kind of responsibility-sensitive telic egalitarianism. Right? It's kind of luck egalitarianism. At the end of the day, what it's concerned to avoid is a state of affairs in which some individuals are worse off through no fault of their own, to use that slogan. It makes comparative assessments within outcomes, and it tries to avoid outcomes where there's inequality that's emerged through no fault of the individuals involved. So the approach might superficially look like an approach to procedural fairness, but it's not at the end of the day, right? The procedure is fair just in case it has a fair outcome as measured in like egalitarian terms. So another curious thing about is the fact that the system of education is competitive, the way I set up the issue, is actually irrelevant to the application of this style of thinking to this case. The responsibility theory would say the same thing about a system of education if it was not competitive. If life prospects were determined in a non-competitive way on the basis of educational outcomes. There was no competition at all. You just got the life prospects that were associated with some level, absolute level of educational outcomes. Now, one might have thought that the competitive aspect of education would introduce a distinct concern about fairness, one that goes beyond trying to avoid inequality that individuals are not responsible for. So if we're going to arrange some aspect of the basic structure of society on a competitive terms, we'd better ensure that it's fair. It's kind of distinct concern. So it would be strange if our answer to the question of what fair competition consists in was just an instance of this more general answer that the responsibility sensitive egalitarian gives to the question of what fairness requires in general. In any case, such an answer would be unacceptable to anyone seeking a less consequentialist teleological answer to the question of what justice requires in education. Okay, so summing up the discussion of the improper influence approach. The approach is the leading egalitarian approach to fairness and equality of opportunity in the contemporary literature. I think that's true. But it has some serious issues, as we've just seen. So how should we respond? Should we double down on the improper influence approach, trying to explain away some of its unintuitive consequences? If you love luck egalitarianism, then you're going to do that. You're going to double down and you're just going to try to explain all the unintuitive consequences. Yes, almost every possible system of education will be massively unfair according to your theory, but there are other values at stake. Let's not forget those. Or we can just abandon the improper influence approach and along with it, any aspiration to understand fairness in egalitarian terms. So we might just argue for a utilitarian, sufficitarian, or prioritarian alternative. A particularly attractive option for egalitarians here is to argue for a sufficiency standard in terms of what is needed for social equality or democratic equality. So this is what theorists like Deborah Satz and Elizabeth Anderson effectively do. They think these kind of assessments of fairness we've been talking about are basically the criticism that they involve appeals to envy is basically right. It's leveling down is problematic. The cool, hip way to think about egalitarianism is in terms of social equality, and we can think about systems of schooling in terms of how well they promote or demote social equality. Now, I actually find that style of thinking about education really appealing. And now's the time to give a little bit of background on this talk. So the approach to justice in education that I'm developing is two parts. It has a part about fairness that we're talking about now, and it has a part about social equality, which is very much in line with what these theorists are thinking of. And so I think some real progress has been made in thinking of systems of education and how they relate to social equality. But I still think there's something to be said for old school assessments of fairness. I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. So here am I trying to give an account of some of our assessments of fairness in systems of schooling, in education, that are kind of acceptable from a broadly relational approach. So, like egalitarianism is kind of ruled out immediately as your foundation for fairness. Although I should say there are theorists developing views that combine kind of a like egalitarian approach to fairness with a relational egalitarian approach to social equality. I think that marriage doesn't really work. Okay, so that's the kind of background. So the final option here then is to take a different approach to fairness and equality of opportunity. Okay, so how are we going? Should I aim for half past, given that we started at?
Yeah, we aim for like 35, maybe.
Oh, I should be. Okay, so that's the background. It should also come with an apology, because I realize that the social equality stuff is fun and sexy, and I'm giving the less sexy. But this is just the bit of the book I'm working on at the moment, and I desperately need this bit of theory to work to get the fairness and social equality bit to pay off. Okay, so let's think about the fair chance approach. So we need a theory of fairness with a different normative structure, I say. So the different normative foundations that I'm going to appeal to are those of relational morality of the kind associated with Scanlon and Wallace. So on this approach, there's a kind of centrality given to the claims we have on each other, as opposed to thinking about the goodness and badness of states of affairs and reasons we might have to promote those states of affairs. Scanlon himself, in his work on inequality, seeks alternative foundations for equality of opportunity and appeals to some familiar kind of Rawlsian rationales that some people say are kind of closer to Rawls's official view than the improper influence approach. So Rawls gave this kind of self-realization rationale and this just inequality rationale. Now, in a review essay that Nico Kolodny wrote, Kolodny finds the self-realization rationale obscure and the just inequality rationale uninformative, and seeks to offer an alternative. And that's the starting place for the alternative I want to offer. So I'm going to go over Kolodny's sketch of an alternative, and then we'll see if we can turn that into a kind of full-blown theory. So as I just said, central to relational morality is the idea that morality is structured around the idea of claims that an individual may have against some agent, that they act in some way. That's the kind of main element. So Kolodny shows how this idea can be appealed to in order to explain certain intuitions about fair chances in an educational setting. So start with the idea that individuals have interest in having their situation improved with respect to leading a fulfilling life. We have an interest in being made better off. If some agent can improve some individual situation at no cost to themselves, then that individual might have a claim against that agent to have their situation improved. They might have a claim. Whether they do depends on whether their situation can be improved without unfairness to others. So it depends on the opportunity costs of improving that person's situation. Call such claims fair improvement claims. So how far can we go explaining fairness and equality of opportunity in terms of just fair improvement claims of this kind? Okay, so let's run through Kolodny's sketch. You'll need example 1, equal potential, on the examples handout. Okay, so this is just an example that Kolodny runs through. Suppose we have a choice between policy P and policy Q, where each policy would give each individual the following chances of being top ranked in terms of educational outcomes. So just stare at that first table there. That's giving you the distribution of chances, right? We might assume that the distribution of chances under P is due to differences in social class background between A and B, and suddenly some resources just fall from heaven, and we've got to make a decision about how to distribute those resources. Okay, they weren't going anywhere else. We're not worrying about opportunity costs. We're not taking it from anywhere. Okay, then suppose as a result of their educational and occupational ranking, their life prospects under each policy look like this. So look at that stare at the second table. Right. Intuitively, with the information I've given you, and any theory you're bringing to bear on this, fair chances are going to be equal chances in this case, right? We should choose policy Q. It would be unfair to A not to distribute the resources in a way that will equalize A and B's chances. What matters now is how we explain this fact. So why are fair chances equal chances? Well, the improper influence approach might say, well, unless we equalize their chances, differences in social class background will explain differences in outcomes. If we choose policy P, then you'll have, I just told you that maybe the difference between A and B is due to social class background, then you're going to get differences in life prospects due to things individuals are not responsible for. But we're ruling out that explanation. So how else might we explain it? Well, we can ask, can we improve a situation without unfairness to others? Right? We can improve a situation by raising her chances from 0.4 to 0.5, moving from P to Q. That's true. Would this be unfair to B? So we can improve an agent's situation. We've got to ask, would this be unfair to determine whether they have a claim to have their situation improved? Well, B can't complain that his interests are being unfairly traded off against A's, since B has as much to gain in maintaining his higher chances as A has to gain by being given higher chances. So B has as much to gain by staying on policy P as A has to gain in the move to policy Q. So B hardly has a complaint in terms of an unfair trade-off between the two individuals' interests. And we're assuming that B doesn't deserve his higher chances or anything like that. Okay. And it seems that B cannot complain about his chances after the change because his chances have been lowered to a point no lower than A's chances have been raised to. Right? It's hard to imagine B having a complaint about that distribution of chances. It would be unreasonable for B to complain. A's chances have been raised to a point no higher than B's chances have been lowered to. So there's no unfairness complaint, yet we can improve A's situation. So on the face of it, A has an improvement claim to higher chances. So we have an alternative explanation of why a fair chance is an equal chance in this example. And the explanation is given entirely in terms of this independent notion of a fair improvement claim. Someone's situation can be improved. Can it be improved without unfairness to others? If yes, then they may have a claim to that improvement. Hopefully we went over that slowly enough to give the kind of intuitive feel for that explanation. So the question is, can we take Golodny's sketch and turn it into a full-blown approach to fairness in education? Well, that's the hope, but there's much work to be done. So when I first encountered this explanation, I thought, oh, cool, it's going to be so easy to generalize this. But it turns out to be incredibly difficult to generalize it. And it's really not obvious what the exact principles being appealed to by Kolodny are in these cases. Anyway, here we go. Here's an attempt to fully generalize. Start with the following basic idea. A distribution of chances within a system of education is fair, or not unfair, just in case no individual has a fair improvement claim to an alternative distribution of chances within that system. So an alternative distribution that we can bring about, one that's available. So this connects the idea of fair chances with fair improvement claims. That's the first step, relatively straightforward. We're making an assessment of a distribution of chances within a system of education, connecting it to fair improvement claims. What remains to be done is to explain when an individual has an improvement claim to an alternative distribution of chances within the system of education. So to keep things tractable, let's just focus on the question of when some individual has a fair improvement claim to some policy, a policy that generates some distribution of chances over another. So just pairwise policy assessments. Otherwise, things get crazy. Okay. So, first steps. Now, I should say, I need to present this slowly and carefully enough so that you understand it well enough to give me objections. My concern about this theory is that people don't understand it, so they cannot object to it. So I need to kind of say it clearly enough that people can think of examples that are going to challenge it, because it's not easy to work with. Okay. So when does an individual have a fair improvement claim to policy P over policy Q? Well, as we've just seen, in general, they have an improvement when they have an improvement interest in P over Q, and the choice of P over Q would not be unfair to others. Just have to apologize for the negations, not unfair. That's just how the theory goes. When would the choice of P over Q not be unfair to others? Well, there's two cases that we considered as we ran through the example. When the choice of P over Q would not unfairly trade off the interests of others, and when the choice of P over Q would not unfairly lower the chances of others. And so far, at this stage, I say, and only then, like these are the two clauses we need to consider. We might want to extend that list, but I haven't really seen any reason to extend it, and developing the kind of basic theory looks like we can work with just these two clauses for now. So we might want to just stop here and refuse to provide a theory of unfair trade-offs or unfair redistributions of chances. We could just reason intuitively about, on a case-by-case basis, about unfair trade-offs or unfair redistributions of chances. That would already give us an alternative approach to fairness and equality. I just told you the questions to ask when determining whether a system of education is fair. I haven't really given you a theory of how to answer those questions. But it would be better to try to be more explicit so that we can properly explore the implications of the approach and compare it with alternatives. So I'm going to sketch a theory of unfair trade-offs and a theory of unfair redistributions of chances. Now, I don't claim that these theories would kind of apply in other contexts. I think these are very plausible in the context we're considering. Okay, so here's the theory of unfair trade-offs. Different individuals will have interests of different weights in favor of the choice of P over Q. Different individuals will have interests of different weights in favor of the choice of Q over P, right? So different interests in different directions. Assume that the weight of these interests have a kind of prioritarian flavor. So it's more important to improve the prospects of those who are poorly off than to improve the prospects of those who are well off. Now we ask, when would the choice of P over Q not be unfair to any of the individuals affected by the choice? Now assume it would not be unfair if no individual would have a complaint relating to the unfair trade-offs. Now I say an individual would have a complaint of this kind against it if and only if the weight of their interests in favor of the choice of Q over P exceeded by some margin the weight of the strongest interest in favor of the choice of P over Q. So you lose in the trade-off after we do the prioritarian weighting, but you lose by some margin. So like losing by the smallest of margin doesn't suffice to give you a complaint yet against that trade-off. You have to lose by some margin, and then you have a complaint. You have an unfair trade-off complaint against that choice. And I say only then could you complain that the choice of P over Q trades off your interest at an unfairly low rate. So that's the theory of unfair trade-offs. Here's the theory of unfair redistributions of chances. So suppose we've ruled out some policies now. If we have more than 2 policies, we might have ruled some out as involving unfair trade-offs of interests. There will still be different distributions of chances within the policies left open. How do we choose between those policies? Well, we appeal to the theory of unfair redistributions of chances. Different individuals will have their chances affected differently in the choice of P over Q. Some will have their chances raised, some will have their chances lowered. Sometimes people's chances won't be affected at all. Assume that we're in a context where people can't complain about unfair trade-offs. So when would the choice of P over Q not be unfair to any of the individuals affected by the choice? Assume it would not be unfair if no individual would have a complaint relating to the redistribution of chances in the move from P to Q. I say an individual would have a complaint of this kind against it if and only if their chances are lowered below the level of the chances of those whose chances are raised. Now, there are alternatives. This is the one I've kind of settled for. It works across a wide range of cases. I'd like to hear what people think about that choice. Okay, so those are the 2 aspects of the theory. So just a few remarks on this approach, then we'll run through some examples and wrap up. So the theory of unfair trade-offs and unfair redistributions of chances cleave very closely to some ideas that Thomas Nagel once remarked seem to be essential to egalitarian thinking. In the theory of unfair trade-offs, we consider things from the point of view of individuals, the individuals who would be made worse off in terms of their life prospects in the choice of P over Q. We're asking when it would be acceptable to them, or at least when they would not have a complaint against the choice of P over Q. In the theory of unfair redistribution of chances, we consider things from the point of view of individuals who would be made worse off in terms of their competitive prospects by the choice of P over Q. They're made worse off in terms of their chances going down. We're asking when it would be acceptable to them, or at least when they would not have a complaint against the choice of P over Q. So we engage only in pairwise comparisons between individuals. There's no aggregation. The numbers don't count. In this way, we respect the separateness of persons in a rather radical way. And we make no within-outcome comparisons. There's no comparing how well off different individuals are in a particular outcome. The approach is an instance of what Matthew Adler calls a claims across outcomes conception of fairness. It's really just trying to develop a theory of that kind. Okay, so that's the theory. We've got 5 to 10 minutes, or 5 minutes left. Just want to run through some examples now. It's kind of heavy going. I might run through the examples a little bit quicker than I should, because you can take a look yourself. I just want to give you a sense of what the theory delivers. So example 1 we already ran through. So good news is the theory explains why fair chances are an equal chance in a pretty standard abstract case. I think that this kind of case is the kind of case a lot of theorists train their intuitions on, and it delivers the verdict that fair chance is an equal chance. Example 2 is an example where suppose A and B actually have the same potential. It's an equal potential case. Suppose the choice of Q over P involves non-competitive costs to the life prospects of A and B. Either non-competitive costs related to the costs of public provision, or non-competitive opportunity costs related to just blocking private provision, right? So you can just stare at the table if you didn't understand any of that. These are the distributions of life prospects under the earlier distribution of chances. The difference here is we've got this kind of non-competitive fall, right? Q is, even though Q is the policy on which chances are equalized and prospects are equalized, they're equalized at a lower level than they are in the earlier example. Now, I've chosen the level to which they fall to illustrate a point here. This is the kind of example that critics of egalitarianism appeal to when they're worried about leveling down. So that A's unweighted interests in Q over P are 0.02, and B's unweighted interests in P over Q are 0.06. And even when you add the prioritarian weighting here, B's losses far outweigh A's gains. And B has an unfair trade-off complaint against the move to Q. So this is a kind of unegalitarian implication of the fair chance approach. But I might say it's the intuitively correct thing to do here. The costs to B are too high. B has a complaint against the move to Q when the non-competitive costs are high. So the fair chance approach, without any kind of trickery, any kind of appeal to pluralism, can explain why a fair chance is not always an equal chance. Okay, so that's a kind of, imagine that as an equal potential case with high costs. The fair chance approach also says interesting things about unequal potential cases. So some unequal potential cases are just going to be like that high cost case. And some individuals are going to have claims against giving other individuals equal chances. Fine, if the non-competitive costs of providing equal chances are too high, that seems right. But importantly, we can now have cases where A and B are at different potential levels, and the very same theory will say we should equalize, right? So look at the next table, or the table under example 3. The costs are just not as high, but we may have individuals with different ability levels. And now we can explain why an equal chance, a fair chance in this case, is an equal chance, even though the individuals have different ability levels. So people who are concerned that fair equality of opportunity is sometimes kind of unfair to people with different ability levels because it says equal chances for people with the same ability, different chances for people with different ability. Well, the fair chance approach says, well, if the costs are not high, if they're relatively low, then a fair chance is an equal chance. And that seems to be the intuitively correct thing to say. All right. So I will spare you example 4. We might discuss it in question time, but I think that's enough to give you a bit of a flavour of the way the fair chance approach kind of plays out in familiar examples from the literature. Can explain why fair chances are often equal chances, and it does that in a way that's kind of blind to differences in ability and motivation. But it can explain why fair chances are not an equal chance in the kind of cases that worry people when they worry about leveling down on the egalitarian approaches. So that all looks good. So let me wrap up. So why is the fair chance approach better? Well, one last thing is that if a system of education is unfair, according to the fair chance approach, it's unjust. And unfairness is a serious moral failing. Someone is wronged. Now, given the way we've set up the theory, if it says a system of education is unfair, you can find the person who is wronged. Right? There's no, it's unfair, but oh well. It's unfair, this person is wronged, we have to address it. So you get the kind of normative seriousness that we associate with assessments of fairness. Assessments of fairness are sensitive to how alternative distributions of chances affect the interests of individuals. So we saw that on the improper influence approach, assessments of fairness are insensitive to how individuals' interests are affected. The fair chance approach is sensitive to this and kind of builds it into its assessments of fairness, which seems to be right. And as we just saw, the fair chance approach can be applied to cases where individuals have equal ability and motivation and to cases where they do not. So it provides a unified approach. There's no need to have a principle of equality supplemented by some other principle. There's just one theory that applies across the board and gives you a kind of unified account of fairness. Okay, thanks for listening.